Good afternoon. My name is Doug Needham, and I'm the Provost and Vice President Academic here at Redeemer University College. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the first event of this year's Zylstra Symposium. And the theme for this year's symposium is Christians and the Politics of Social Justice. So let's just talk about that for a moment, and then we will talk a little bit about Bernard Zylstra, after whom this symposium is named, and we'll talk also a little bit about the trust that has made this event possible. The gaps between the rich and the poor in our globalized world are widening. Yet, in the developed world, debt and consumerism now threaten not only the poor, but the rich as well, as we read about countries like Greece and Italy and Ireland that are sagging more and more under the burden of decades of unrestrained materialism. Public will to undo the damage seems minimal, and the developing world is choked off from risk-averse investors. And as always, the most vulnerable, the poor, the marginal, the elderly, the mentally ill, they suffer the most extremely. And as Christians in North America, we have access to education, opportunity, and resources. We are rich Christians. And so what can we do and what should we do with this wealth to serve the kingdom of God by addressing the brokenness of our world? We'll explore this and more in this year's symposium. The Zylstra Symposium was named after the late Dr. Bernard Zylstra, who was trained in theology, law, and philosophy of jurisprudence. Dr. Zylstra taught political philosophy at the Institute of Christian Studies in Toronto and served as its principal for many years. He was a key figure in the Reformational movement among post-World War II North American Christian thinkers, and it was the hope that the symposium would carry the signature of Dr. Zylstra's impassioned vision, and that is that this world is the domain of Christ. This year's symposium is generously supported by the Priscilla and Stanford Reed Trust. Provisions in the wills of the late Dr. Reed and his wife Priscilla established a substantial trust for the support of Reformed and Presbyterian theological education in Canada. The trust looks for opportunities to work cooperatively with existing organizations and institutions in the sponsorship within Canada of conferences, public presentations, and lectures that reflect a Reformed and Presbyterian perspective. So thanks very much to the Priscilla and Stanford Reed Trust, and because of that, Redeemer has been able to offer this year's two-day symposium featuring engaging speakers and panelists on a variety of different topics. For this evening's presentation, we welcome our two keynote speakers, Dr. Ruth Melkonian-Hoover, a professor of political science from Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts, and Dr. Jordan Ballor, a research fellow at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And we'll learn more about Drs. Melkonian-Hoover and Ballor a little bit later on this evening. Tomorrow, Dr. Melkonian-Hoover will present a chapel talk at 11 o'clock, and Dr. Ballor will deliver a lecture in the evening at 7:30 in room 213. Tomorrow afternoon, we will have three panel sessions on social justice and the politics of education, the politics of sustainability, and the politics of community poverty. In total, we will have 9 different panelists tomorrow, so please try to attend as many events as you can, and we certainly hope that you'll find them all thought-provoking, inspiring, and challenging messages. We're now ready to enjoy a dinner together, after which we'll have our evening program. And before we begin our meal, would you please allow me to open with prayer? So let us pray. Our loving God and Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful fall day, and we thank you for this university, and we thank you for the Zylstra Symposium that is beginning this evening. We thank you for all of the participants, those who are presenting, those who will be in the audience, and we thank you for the opportunity to hold this important event at Redeemer and for the Priscilla and Stanford Reed Trust that has helped to make it possible. Lord, we pray that the next 2 days will enlighten us, inspire us, and help us to stand up against the social injustice in the world. Lord, we ask now that you bless our time together of eating and discussing and chatting at our tables. We thank you for the food that we are about to enjoy, and we ask that it will help to sustain us and energize us for the activities of the evening ahead. Please forgive our sins. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I would like to just introduce our moderator for this evening's discussions. And our moderator is Dr. Rob Zylstra. Rob is an alumnus of Redeemer University College, and he is also a recent faculty hire at Redeemer. Rob is our new Assistant Professor of International Studies. So let's welcome Rob as our moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Needham. It's a real treat to be here and to see so many familiar faces, many of you my students. Welcome. I mean, it's a really special treat, I think, actually, to introduce, which is all that I will do briskly here and then moderate later, our two esteemed lecturers this evening who have joined us from far and wide, a country which, I mean, is it even a country anymore? So we don't know if they'll claim asylum or not this evening, but we'll keep you apprised. We're all welcome. Yeah. I will say, for those of you who brought your smartphones, and for those of you who are tweeting, the hashtag for this evening is hashtag Zylstra 2013. Please do tweet away, and if you see students with their heads buried in their phones, that's all right. As long as you sort of find them tweeting. If they're texting their friends, that's not all right. So, I'm supposed to be wearing this. I'm sorry. All right. Well, on to the program. First up, and I'll introduce Dr. Jordan Ballor first, and then we'll hear from him, and then I'll introduce Dr. Ruth Melkonian-Hoover in turn, so you remember properly what's happening. But Dr. Jordan Ballor self-describes himself as a blue-collar scholar. And I like that. It has a certain rhyme to it. He's wearing a blue collar this evening. But in addition to his blue-collar bona fides, he does indeed have a Doctor of Theology from the University of Zurich. He's a research fellow at the Acton Institute, and he serves, I would say, in a very prominent way as the executive editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality, which is a very well-respected, peer-reviewed journal that is produced out of that think tank, the Acton Institute. He's the author most recently, and I'm embarrassed to say it's so recent I haven't actually read it yet. I had to confess that. But I'm sure it's really good, as the other ones are, of Get Your Hands Dirty, Essays on Christian Social Thought and Action, and then also Covenant, Causality, and Law, and the very fine, and if you're a student here, you will read it at some point, Ecumenical Babble, Confusing Economic Ideology and the Church's Social Witness from 2010. He's also Associate Director of the Junius, I said that right? Junius Institute, thank you, for Digital Reformation Research, and a doctoral candidate, because one is not enough, in Historical and Moral Theology at Calvin Theological Seminary. This is, I think, the last of your speaking engagements this fall, because, as we can see, he keeps very busy, and he is also expecting in a little over a month. Not him, but his wife. And, of course, his Twitter account, and you can find him, is at Jordan Ballor. So feel free to send him your sassy remarks on his work this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Ballor. So you need to wear this.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Rob. Thank you for the hospitality so far here at Redeemer University College. It's my first visit, and it's a beautiful campus, and I'm very pleased to be here. When I submitted the title for this talk some time back, the title I gave was Proximity, Globalization, and the Common Good. I thought that would be broad enough that I could fit whatever I wanted to talk to in those terms. In the meantime, I have added the subtitle, Beyond Lumpers and Splitters. So we'll develop that this evening. From a variety of perspectives, particularly economics, one of the most significant features of life today is that of globalization. That multifaceted phenomenon, which includes things like global supply chains and cloud servers, Facebook and Twitter, at Jordan Ballor is what you can think, as well as Compassion International, World Renew, and McDonald's. The fact of globalization has spurred serious and sustained attention from scholars and commentators from a variety of perspectives, worldviews, and disciplines. It has also sparked responses of various kinds, from the unabashedly critical to the critically receptive, and numerous others, more or less positive or negative. There are efforts to condemn globalization and its consequences, as we find in many mainline ecumenical pronouncements. There are efforts to refine, reform, or ameliorate the deleterious consequences of globalization, from programs like fair trade to socially responsible investing, to advocacy for things like conscious capitalism and transforming business. In these brief comments this evening, I will attempt to highlight some of the salient features of current debates over globalization within the context of a broader historical and philosophical perspective than might be offered by economics or economic models along the lines of a cost-benefit analysis, on the one hand, or on the other hand, moral theorizing, devoid of correction and grounding in the realities of social science, or what Joseph Ratzinger once called not morality, but moralism. To this end, I will explore the relationship between globalism and localism, the problems of proximity, within a framework of what I'm calling lumpers and splitters. Now, after examining what lumpers and splitters tend to do within the realm of social analysis, I will argue that an authentically biblical and Christian perspective about the nature of the human person and social life provides us with a fruitful way forward. This Christian perspective of human beings created in God's image and likeness, fallen into sin, redeemed through the work of Jesus Christ for the consummation of the new heavens and the new earth, provide us with a corrective, or what I believe to be a properly chastened view of social development or progress, whether in general, such as throughout history, or in the case of particular phenomena like globalization. Now, these terms, lumpers and splitters, have their origin in the fields of biology and the necessities of taxonomy. But they represent a more recent way of capturing the essence of a very old philosophical problem, the problem of the one and the many. This is in part why these tendencies, that is to lump and to split, have been helpfully identified and discussed in other fields and disciplines beyond the natural sciences, including notably that of historiography and, as I will argue tonight, social thought. Now, the difference between lumpers and splitters is perhaps most epigrammatically captured in the Greek proverb attributed to Archilochus. The fox knows many things, the hedgehog one big thing. So instead of lumpers and splitters, we might as well talk about foxes and hedgehogs. Or, to translate it even more directly into the realm of social thought and philosophy, we might speak of collectivists and individualists. We might helpfully characterize lumpers and splitters in the realm of social thought in terms of their respective valuations of individual goods relative to the common good. To put it simply, lumpers prioritize the common good relative to that of individual goods, sometimes even to the detriment of individual goods, while splitters emphasize the importance of individual goods over the common good, sometimes even to the extent of denying the common good as a coherent concept. Now, for lumpers, who value the common good above all, the most salient category of social analysis is the general welfare, often construed in terms of well-being of the poorest, most vulnerable, or otherwise most oppressed class of society. Because of the nature of modern life, the institution that is most often tasked with the realization of the common good is the civil government. This is true even to the extent that the good of government is often simply identified or conflated with the common good itself. This is why it is significant, I think, when someone like Barney Frank, a prominent former leader in the U.S. House of Representatives, identifies government as, quote, the name we give to the things we choose to do together. Now, this way of thinking tends to reduce the value of an individual in a society to what he or she contributes to the whole, usually measured in some quantifiable material terms, whether by some standard like the amount of funds contributed via taxation to the government's budget, or to the respective share per capita of gross domestic product. Occasionally, there is more differentiation than this simple conflation of government and the common good, to include another sector of society, namely that of the economy. But even in these cases, the division of labor in realizing the common good can simply be rendered in a dichotomy between the for-profit competitive motivations of the market and the beneficent non-profit nature of government. This, for instance, is how President Barack Obama of the United States described things in a congressional address in which he contrasted the profit-seeking nature of health insurance companies with the non-profit nature of government. Thus, he advocated for a governmentally administered alternative designed to, quote, keep insurance companies honest by making a not-for-profit public option available in the public exchange, which we're supposed to go live today in the United States. Now, this kind of perspective traps the human person between market and state, a precarious position to be in, to say the least. This is even more so the case when the interests of market and state are increasingly aligned or confused. As Jim Skillen, the former president of the Center for Public Justice, has warned, there's a real danger in the cronyism characteristic of much of what passes for democratic regimes in the West today. Thus, writes Skillen, quote, if the reason government exists is to protect free individuals and their prosperity, then business enterprises and the government share essentially the same purpose, namely to sustain freedom for private enterprising so that economic growth can continue to benefit both business and the larger society. Now, this sharing or confusing of purpose, argues Skillen, blurs the necessary and distinct lines between the market and the government, allowing for both capture and subsuming of the government to economic interests in the form of regulatory capture and rent-seeking, as well as, I would argue, the politicizing and tyrannizing of economic action via government coercion. Skillen thus writes of the reality of a mixed economy, which is his term, or what the economist Luigi Zingales of the University of Chicago cogently describes as either socialist or cronyist, depending on which institution dominates. So thus Zingales says, when a business obtains both market and political power, escape becomes impossible. Under these circumstances, the system starts to resemble a socialist economy instead of a free market. In a socialist economy, the political system controls business. In a crony capitalist system of this kind, business controls the political process. And he continues, either way, competition is absent and freedom shrinks. Without competition, economic life becomes unfair, favoring the connected insider. Now, these are all illustrations of the animating force of lumpers to subsume individual goods to some definition of a greater good, whether defined in terms of ever increasing GDP figures or increasing equalization of income or something else. I'm going to conclude this characterization of social lumpers with two more examples, one drawn from the real world and the other from the more interesting and often more illuminating realm of fiction. The first is an article that appeared this past August in an online magazine called Slate, in which the author, Alison Benedict, claimed that, quote, you are a bad person if you send your child to private school. You are a bad person if you send your children to private school, sorry. Her point is that the voluntary opting out of the public school system in the United States amounts to an indefensible prioritizing of the needs of particular children in particular families over the needs of the rest. To these parents, Benedict advises, you want the best for your child, but your child doesn't need it. If you can afford private school, even if affording means scrimping and saving or taking out loans, chances are that your spawn will be perfectly fine at a crappy public school. She will have support at home. That's you. And all the advantages that go along with being a person whose family can pay for and cares about superior education. The exact kind of family that can help your crappy public school become less crappy. She may not learn as much or be as challenged, but take a deep breath and live with that. Benedict's message is clear. Perhaps your child will not be the best she can be without a privileged private school education, but that sacrifice is worthwhile because it is a sacrifice made for the common good. On this view, the moral imperative is to sacrifice the individual good of a particular child out of devotion to the effort to improve public schools, even if it might take generations. As Benedict puts it, your children and grandchildren might get mediocre educations in the meantime, but it will be worth it for the eventual common good. Now, lumpers like Benedict are all too happy to sacrifice and even stunt individual goods out of allegiance to the common good, or their definition of the common good. The logical end of this approach to the common good is what might be accurately called totalitarian collectivism. And I'll draw my final illustration of the lumpers and of the common good from the well-known book by Madeleine L'Engle, A Wrinkle in Time. Rob tells me it's L'Engle.
I was wrong.
It's L'Engle. Okay, well, that's how Americans pronounce it anyway, which makes it the right way to pronounce it, I'm sure. Madeleine L'Engle. If you haven't read the book, I apologize for the spoilers, but it's your own fault for not having read it. It's been out quite a long time, and you're remiss for not having read it. And in any case, a summary is in order. The Murray siblings, Meg and Charles Wallace, they travel with their new friend Calvin O'Keefe to the planet of Camazotz in search of the Murray's father, who's been missing for a number of years. In the course of their rescue attempt, the three children confront the creature It, a disembodied brain which resides in the planet's capital city, and which imposes, through the strength of its intellect and will, supreme order throughout the entire planet. L'Engle describes It this way: a disembodied brain, an oversized brain, just enough larger than normal to be completely revolting and terrifying. A living brain, a brain that pulsed and quivered, that seized and commanded. No wonder the brain was called It. It was the most horrible, the most repellent thing Meg had ever seen, far more nauseating than anything she had ever imagined with her conscious mind, or that had ever tormented her in her most terrible nightmares. But the world of Camazotz, under the tyranny of It, is not merely aesthetically repellent. Its vision of life is morally repugnant as well. At one point, It speaks through Charles Wallace of the planet Earth. Why do you think we have wars at home? Why do you think people get confused and unhappy? Because they all live their own separate individual lives. I've been trying to explain to you in the simplest possible way that on Camazotz, individuals have been done away with. Camazotz is one mind. It's It. And that's why everybody is so happy and efficient. Just as individuals have been done away with, so have individual goods. It is the consummate central planner. It embodies, in its uniquely disembodied way, the ethos and hubris of collectivism. It is a lumper, a mind completely given over to the libido dominandi, the lust for dominating power. And Camazotz is a vision of the hellish existence of the lumpers and the common good. Now, if the lumpers represent the error of collectivism, then the splitters represent the errors of individualism. Where lumpers subsume individual goods to the common good, splitters value merely individual goods. To the extent that the common good is given any value at all, it is only abstractly as an aggregation of individual goods. As the late Margaret Thatcher once put it bluntly, there is no such thing as society. Now, to be fair, Lady Thatcher was intending to critique the tendency of lumpers to rely on government, as the context of her quote indicates. Thus, she proceeds to argue that indeed, there is no such thing as society. There is a living tapestry of men and women and people, and the beauty of that tapestry and the quality of our lives will depend on how much each of us is prepared to take responsibility for ourselves, and each of us prepared to turn around and help by our own efforts those who are unfortunate. But in contrast to Lady Thatcher's appeal to the concrete obligations and expressions of solidarity seen in family and charity, for example, the splitters, we might say, for them there is no such thing as civil society. It's worth noting, I think, that the splitters' approach to individual goods often arises as an intended corrective to the excesses of the lumpers. In the case of Friedrich Hayek, for instance, his doubts about the idea of social justice as a concept are linked to his preference for the society that arises out of the uncoordinated activities of free individuals, or what he calls spontaneous order. We might say that Hayek's strong preference is for spontaneous justice rather than planned justice. Ayn Rand, of course, stands as an archetypal figure articulating the priority of the individual over any social construct. A common criticism of an idea like social justice resides not so much in concern with the justice part, but rather with the social part. The modifier social in this view leads all too often and all too quickly and inevitably to socialism. But the methodological individualism characteristic of much economic analysis, both mainstream and heterodox, tends to express the splitter mentality. At least in its extreme forms, the mechanical versions of methodological individualism, which are characteristic of Homo economicus model, these versions of methodological individualism tend to abstract the human individual from the concrete realities that exist in the real world in favor of an ideal, utility-maximizing rational actor. As Peter Boettke and Christopher Coyne have argued, methodological individualism need not necessarily come to expression in such abstracted forms that rule out the consideration and relationship between individuals and institutions, for instance. But when the models that employ methodological individualism are not properly bounded and delimited, when the individual qua individual becomes the entirety of economic analysis rather than a necessary but insufficient explanatory factor, then we are left with an ideal and utterly unrealistic picture of social life. Human existence becomes occasional, accidental, and atomistic. We have seen in Lengel's vision of Camazotz what a collectivist hell might look like. And in C.S. Lewis's picture of hell in The Great Divorce, we have a vision of what the individualist hell might look like. The depiction of hell in The Great Divorce is that of a series of individuals given the ability to manifest their greatest internal desire, to define reality for themselves, and to have absolute sovereignty within their own realms. As Lewis writes, quote, "Every state of mind left to itself, every shutting up of the creature within the dungeon of its own mind is, in the end, hell." One of the more striking illustrations that he uses is the case of Napoleon Bonaparte in a huge house, all in the Empire style, marching around insistently, muttering to himself all the time, "It was Soult's fault, it was Ney's fault, it was Josephine's fault." Everyone in hell has their own house and move farther and farther apart as time passes. As Lewis writes, you can see the lights of the inhabited houses, where those old ones live, millions of miles away, millions of miles from us and one another. Hell, on C.S. Lewis's account, is a consequence of methodological individualism run amok. Now, it should be apparent from even this brief sketch that neither approach, that of the lumpers or the splitters, is adequate. It isn't enough merely to know one big thing or many little things. As these perspectives come to expression in visions of social life, we can see how collectivism and individualism are, in fact, mirror images. Both evince a basic dichotomy between the collective and the singular, giving relative weight either to the former in the case of the lumpers or the latter in the case of the splitters. But the basic framework for social analysis is consistent between the two, and the lumper and splitter models are, in fact, entirely complementary. When he was once asked whether there was anything at all between the individual and the state, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE, and current economics professor Richard Ebeling answered in the negative. "No," he said, "nothing at all." This response, amounting to a denial of the reality of civil society, and indeed of social life altogether, captures perfectly the dynamics at the heart of the errors of both the lumpers and the splitters. Now, in the brief time left tonight, I will sketch a Christian alternative to the frameworks of the lumpers and the splitters, a framework which we will no doubt explore, hopefully in more detail during the discussion time tonight, and which I will flesh out more fully and systematically in my talk tomorrow evening. But for now, allow me to point to the resources for moving beyond the binary thinking of the individual versus the collective that arise out of some of the basic teachings of Orthodox Christianity. Here I will limit my comments to the implications arising from the Bible's teachings related to the creation and fall of human beings. Now, human beings, human persons, created in the image and likeness of God, possess an inherent dignity arising from our responsibility before God and in relationship to the created order. We've been created in relationship with God and placed as stewards over his good creation. But in addition to the dignity attending to the individual human person, there's a corresponding sociality that orients us not only toward God, but towards one another. Male and female, he created them, as we read in Genesis 1:27. This sociality is in part captured in the reciprocity of obligation expressed in the two great love commandments, directed first toward God and secondly towards our neighbors. The sociality of the human person is attested to in the observation that it was not good for Adam, the first man, to be alone, as we read in Genesis 2. Thus we have, in the brief but cosmic compass of Genesis 1 and 2, an account of the human person created with dignity and corresponding responsibility, an individual that is inherently social and other-directed, in relationship with God, neighbor, and the rest of the created order. These realities are what led Augustine, following Aristotle's identification of the human being as a social or political animal, a zoon politikon, to observe that there is nothing so social by nature as this race of human beings. So in contrast to the lumpers, individual human beings and their goods are significant. Each person is created uniquely by God and has a corresponding and irreducible dignity. Each one of us is unique, just like everyone else. But in contrast to the impetus of the splitters, we do not exist as autonomous and self-sufficient individuals. We are unique individuals in part because of the concrete relationships and obligations that attend to our birth at a particular time and place, to a particular family. Apart from your own individual talents and dispositions, there is no one else in human history who exists at the center of the complex of relationships as son or daughter, spouse, friend, parent, worker, communicant member, or citizen as you. So in tandem with our individual uniqueness, our institutional settings gain significance. In contrast to some forms of methodological individualism, institutions like the family, schools, for-profit firms, nonprofit charities, churches, and governments are significant because they are, to an important extent, both determinative of and determined by individuals. Now, the significance of social institutions, including but by no means limited to the government, is a hallmark of authentic Christian social thought of a variety of particular Christian traditions. Frameworks which emphasize institutions like the family, culture, church, and government are shared by Christian thinkers across time and tradition. In the case of recent Roman Catholic social thought, for instance, the work of Michael Novak, particularly in the spirit of democratic capitalism, emphasizes institutions like the church and the family, anticipating many of the themes that would be expressed nearly a decade later in Pope John Paul II's social encyclical Centesimus Annus. And as well known here at Redeemer, one of the significant legacies of Abraham Kuyper and Neo-Calvinism is the importance given to the integrity and responsibility of the social spheres or institutions. Similarly, the Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer employed a basic social ethical framework consisting of the family and marriage, work and culture, church, and the government. In each of these cases, and many more could be enumerated, the significance of social institutions cuts across the impulse of the splitters, even while the individuality of the human person and individual goods are defended against the totalizing threat of the lumpers. Now, the second Christian teaching that serves as a corrective to the errors of lumping and splitting is the doctrine of the fall of human beings into sin. Quite often, there is an implicit, if not an explicit, secularized vision of eschatological peace that goes along with the programs of lumpers and splitters. If only we could have put into place the perfect plan, the right institutions, the right laws, we might enjoy peace on earth. If only we would do away with the oppressive intrusions of Leviathan, we might enjoy a land flowing with milk and honey. The Christian understanding of sin undercuts such fantasy. There is a reason that in this fallen world, even empowered by the renewing presence of the Holy Spirit, Christians seek not the common best, but the common good. Christians know, as the reformational formula went, that all too often, old Adam is too strong for young Luther. We do not live in an age of systems so perfect that they are incorruptible or function independently of moral actors. Neither do we live in an age when God is all in all, and whose inhabitants, therefore, in the formula of James Madison, need no government on account of their angelic virtue. To conclude with a brief thought about the relationship between globalization and localism, in light of what we've seen with respect to the lumpers and the splitters, too often, I would say, these two, globalism and localism, are opposed. The real opposite of localism isn't globalization as such, if we mean things like international trade or commerce, travel, or migration. The real opposite of localism is, rather, in my view, centralization, which can be a manifestation of globalization, but need not be. What we really need to be wary of is the reality of centralization in the various spheres, particularly government, which undermines local responsibility and identity. Where globalization comes to manifestation in massive bureaucratic agencies, whether commercial, non-governmental, governmental, or intergovernmental, then there is cause for significant concern with all the defects of centralization. As the German economist Wilhelm Röpke argued, centralization is a manifestation of lumping, with the splitting of isolated individuals in mass society as one of its identifying characteristics. Thus, Röpke wrote, "Mass society is simply a sand heap of individuals who are more dependent than ever, less sharply defined and more depersonalized than ever, and at the same time more isolated, uprooted, abandoned, and socially disintegrated than ever." The Christian quest for the common good is not reducible to either the simple aggregate of individual goods or the promotion of the needs of the many at the expense of the good of the few. It is rather a call to love and justice pursued in humble faithfulness as disciples of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to whom we pray, "Come, Lord Jesus, quickly come." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ballor. Steal that microphone. Lots for us to think about, and I will encourage you to put some of those thoughts down, to keep them sort of brewing, as it were, because after this we'll have a chance to challenge Jordan on some of his more outrageous claims during that talk, and I look forward to that personally. But before that happens, but before we get there, of course we have the opportunity of a response and some comments in her own right from Dr. Ruth Melkonian-Hoover. Dr. Melkonian-Hoover comes from a kindred, I would say a very familiar institution to many of us here at Redeemer, Gordon College. And we may yet succeed in inviting their entire political science department to come and address us, given that last year's Zylstra lectures we had Dr. Paul Brink, who is a Redeemer alumnus. But we enjoyed our time with Dr. Brink so much, we thought we must have his boss, and so the chair of the department has come in the form of Dr. Ruth Melkonian-Hoover. And of course, as you sort of look people up, as you do, I turn to Google, as I think everyone does. The difference with professors is we don't end at Google. And I found some very flattering remarks about I found some very flattering remarks about Dr. Melkonian-Hoover on, of course, rateyourprofessor.com. And I'll summarize those here as, quote, "the best teacher in the world," 3 exclamation marks, end quote, and simply slamming. I think we can agree great things are afoot. Well, all right, more formally. Professor Melkonian-Hoover teaches Latin American politics, developing nations, and women and politics. She received her bachelor's degree from Biola University and her master's and doctorate degree from Emory University. She's co-chair of the International Affairs major at Gordon and was a recent guest editor of the outstanding Review of Faith and International Affairs for their publication on the theme issue, Christian Perspectives on U.S. Immigration Policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Melkonian-Hoover.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. It's not true. And thank you as well. I also want to echo just a wonderful, warm welcome from all of you here at Redeemer. It's a privilege to be here. So I do know Redeemer through the eyes of Paul Brink and Jen Brink, who send their greetings and say wonderful things about Redeemer, and we're very thankful to have them at Gordon. I'm also reliant upon David Koizes' text for one of my courses, thank you very much, and increasingly the extensive writings of Rob Zylstra. So, and I should say that I am not a political theorist. I am, as noted, I'm not a theologian. I am a political scientist, a comparativist at that, and so I will approach my response and my remarks in that manner. First, I just want to affirm where Jordan ends up with this Christian way forward and a way between collectivism and individualism, socialism and liberalism, which I'm sure so many of us can agree with. I appreciate his focus that, of course, we are all made in the image of God, and that shapes how we think in this regard in terms of institutions, that we are relational beings, that government is merely part of an array of important and key institutions that are to be redeemed and upheld and supported. And a final recognition that, of course, institutions and individuals are all fallen, and we have to keep that in mind, of course. So I'm excited about what he has put forth here, but I hope that he can take some more time in the Q&A, and I know some of this will happen tomorrow evening, but just even parsing out more so the role of these particular spheres, their functions, schools, families, businesses, nonprofits, churches, and governments. And then even prior to that, I would appreciate from him what definition he is using when he refers to the common good, and want to make sure that he is perhaps in line with what I'm thinking about the promotion of the welfare of all, or conditions that allow the flourishing of all. But I just want to be sure we're all on the same page. As a political scientist, I'm particularly interested in further consideration of the institution of government and its positive functions. And so I find myself in the unusual position of defending Barney Frank. So I would like to say, when he refers to perhaps as government as the name we give to things we choose to do together, I would pull back perhaps a bit. It would be helpful to have the context for which he said that. But as well, I would presume that he is referring to other politicians thinking about what they are doing together for the greater good. And I'm not sure that Frank himself would deny other subsets within society or the body politic that would engage in activities that don't involve the government, that are for the good of all. And simultaneously, I would also say that there is a particular and very important and primary role that government does play. Is there any other institution that makes decisions with potential input from the entire population, if within a democracy? So I think that is incredibly important here. Government is not outside us. It ought to be us. And so I would put forth and want us to think about the positive role for government in terms of, as James Skillen would say, the fostering of a just political community as being a particular and primary role. And as Marathon refers to it, right, temporally, having the topmost position, as its power does come as well from the people, and that is its particular and God-ordained role. But I would want to think about, what is then an appropriate role for government, if we are kind of wanting to understand between the lumpers and the splitters what it can do appropriately and well? Is that simply defense? Is that the protection of political and civil liberties? I'm really going to push for specifics if I can. Is that care of public goods, parks, infrastructure, bridges, emergency disaster relief, and so on? Is that the facilitation of the and development of the economy? Is that simply market oversight? Is that oversight of natural resources within one's borders, and so on? So I would love to hear more in that regard. I would also echo another political scientist from my department who may be here next year, Timothy Sherritt. He recently wrote for comment in this regard in support of government, that it is a mistake to understand civil society on its own without government support. That government support is absolutely crucial for its flourishing in the pursuit of the common good. And I would point to, in the case of the United States, that the U.S. government has recognized a great variety of sectors that do serve the common good. Particularly in relationship to charitable choice legislation, while not perfect, it certainly has gone a long way in this regard. And the efforts of the White House Office on faith-based and community partnerships. As noted in a press release by the White House in 2009 celebrating the office, President Barack Obama noted, "There is much that government can and must do to help people in need. But no matter how much money we invest or how sensibly we design our policies, the change that Americans are looking for will not come from government alone. There is a force for good greater than government. It is an expression of faith, this yearning to give back, this hungering for a purpose larger than our own, that reveals itself not simply in places of worship, but in senior centers and shelters, schools and hospitals, and any place an American decides." Moving beyond platitudes in terms of greater specifics, right? There is further discussion here about how precisely this office can support nonprofits and community organizations, helping them find ways to make a bigger impact in their communities, learn their obligations under the law, cut through red tape, make the most of what federal government has to offer, and think on ways in which they can work collaboratively. An additional area of focus in Jordan's remarks was that of the concern of education and its relationship to the common good. And of course, he raises this interesting example or proposition put forth by Anna Benedict that only a bad person would choose to put their children in private schools. But I would like to create a very different kind of picture or an example of those who would prioritize the individual and the family, certainly to the detriment of the common good in this regard. And in the case of perhaps the evaluation of the status of public education in a country like India. In India, for decades, public education has been severely neglected by the state, in part because of its neglect by middle and upper classes. The education of the poor has been very little concern of theirs. Some certainly have not believed that all are made in the image of God, and some have presumed that those in those particular strata deserve their station in life. And in fact, public education might decrease the pool of the serviceable classes available for their particular families and classes and so on. Investment in public education has been quite meager, and India has severely experienced the impact of that. Compared to other rising developing nations of their size, they have one of the lowest literacy rates and one of the lowest rates of enrollment rates for education altogether. Here, some focus on public justice and the common good in the realm of education could go a very, very long way. In fact, I will be a bit provocative. I know where I am based here right now at Redeemer in terms of questions of private school education and Christian education, but I do want to raise some concerns with how private schools sometimes are pitched vis-a-vis public schools in the American case, where sometimes grave injustices can occur. I, at times, do take issue with churches that can use their moral suasion to press their adherents to attend Christian schools or to homeschool when it can be, at times, to the neglect of public schools and opportunities to improve and contribute to public education, when that is not even, perhaps, a consideration that ought to be promoted. Within the U.S. system, I would say, grave injustices can also be perpetuated in this arena in particular states when private schools do not have the obligation or responsibility to educate every child while public schools do, which means that public schools only have to take on the children with the greatest expenses and needs, and private schools are allowed to negate that responsibility and spend their resources elsewhere, clearly what I would see as an unjust and unfair advantage. In many states, when parents opt out, resources leave the public schools, and in terms of justice, unless private schools have some of the same obligations and responsibilities, it's hard to see how public justice and the common good are fully served in this realm. Finally, I want to get to this question of globalization and some of your centralization concern, perhaps. But I want to raise the question of what of international institutions, to be provocative again. Many have written, of course, extensively on how the European Union has its roots in notions of subsidiarity. And many would say that there can be an appropriate functioning for supranational or transnational institutions to deal with issues that are best addressed at transnational or supranational levels. Particularly when we think of the nature and scale of problems at the global level, it seems that we ought to be able to consider what institution or combination of institutions ought to be involved in addressing problems effectively. Here I would point back again to James Skillen, who's written on this as well, on the need for transnational public authorities to lay down and enforce laws for global public justice. I would also point to, of course, Pope Benedict in 2009 in Caritas in Veritate, a long quote here, but I think an important one, bear with me. One also senses the urgent need to find innovative ways of implementing the principle of the responsibility to protect and of giving poorer nations an effective voice in shared decision-making. This seems necessary in order to arrive at a political, juridical, and economic order which can increase and give direction to international cooperation for the development of all peoples in solidarity. To manage the global economy, to revive economies hit by the crisis, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and the greater imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment and to regulate migration. For all this, there is urgent need of a true world political authority, as my predecessor, Blessed John XXIII, indicated some years ago. Such an authority would need to be regulated by law, to observe consistently the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity, to seek to establish the common good, and to make a commitment to securing authentic, integral human development inspired by the values of charity in truth. Again, I thank you and am encouraged by the way you have described this Christian way forward. I would love greater specificity in terms of and justification for and the rationales for the roles of particular institutions, and of course, particularly that of government. Thank you.
Do you want us both to come up there? Or?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. That was, I think, a few small challenges there, but also room for a very full conversation. What I think I'll do at this point is, there were a couple sort of fairly direct questions,
right.
So I thought I might sort of give you a moment to respond briefly, sort of in form, and then that will also give us a chance, those of us who are here, to kind of get our heads thinking about questions that we also have. So, Dr. Ballor, why don't you give some response?
Thank you for that. I think very engaging challenge and set of questions. As for the roles of these institutions, I hate to cheap out, but that is precisely what I'm going to talk about tomorrow night. I'll tell you that they start.
Stay tuned.
There are 4 of them, and they start with the letter P. So you can show up tomorrow night and find out. As for my definition of the common good, I accept. Basically, I think the gist of where you were going. It's a set of conditions which tend to promote the flourishing of all and not the detriment of any. Now, the common good is one of these terms that is notoriously difficult to pin down precisely what it means. But I'm comfortable with something like that in terms of what we're talking about in terms of the common good. And it's in the Catholic Catechism, I think, and one of the encyclicals that there's a paragraph that defines it in those terms. Which I think is actually amenable. It's not a specifically Roman Catholic sort of approach, I don't think. Government and, I can't even read my own writing, I'm sorry. Government and institutions. So this is with respect to the Barney Frank quote. I will admit that I did not do the due diligence with respect to Barney Frank's context. I use that, I mean, obviously as a sort of to capture a particular view, and it may not be Barney Frank's own view. If he had just added some in front of the word "some" in front of things that we do together, that'd have been fine with me. Government is the name of some of the things that we do together, that we choose to do together. Business is also the name of some of the things that we choose to do together. So there's a lot of questions about what are the specific tasks of government. I will talk more about what I think the basic task of government is tomorrow night. And I think it is clearly distinguished from an alternative view. What I will say right now is that there was another comment, we're taking these political comments, Barney Frank and Barack Obama and Lady Thatcher. Barack Obama also had another phrase which you may have heard this last election cycle: "You didn't build that." And he was talking about, well, I think in context what he was talking about is that there are many conditions that things that government does that allow for the flourishing of businesses. Basically, you could just call it infrastructure in a general way. And that the business didn't build that. It didn't build the roads to its front door, for example, right? And I think that's very true. So it's an argument against this sort of self-made man or self-made woman idea that these businesses spring up out of individual genius apart from historical conditions and specific relationships. And I think that's absolutely true. We didn't build ourselves, right? So let me end with one more thing about education. At least in the United States, as far as I know, and I'm not an education policy expert, but I do have kids in school. And I belong to a church that does, the Christian Reformed Church, which does promote Christian parochial education. I'm also familiar with some other traditions like the Lutheran tradition. I do wonder, part of this question has to come down to who has the primary responsibility with respect to making these decisions. Is it the government? Is it the community? Is it the family? And I think that pretty consistently the Christian tradition has argued that the primary responsibility to foresee the moral development and the intellectual formation of children lies with the parents. And they have a variety of options for fulfilling those responsibilities, which include public or private education or homeschooling. I do wonder about this seeming moral responsibility to send your kids to public school after you've already paid taxes to provide for the upkeep of those private schools. Anybody who's making sacrifices to send their kids to public schools, the scrimping and saving that Alison Benedict talked about, realizes that there's a kind of double taxation, I think, that's going on. And the Center for Public Justice has written a lot, I think, admirable stuff on education policy and the injustice of that sort of a system. I do think that this is one of the major public justice issues in the United States. I don't have any more information about India, for example. I do think that you could argue that in many specific cases the government does have a responsibility to provide for the education of its citizens, to at least make it available, if not compulsory. There's a question, I think, about that and what level it ought to be compulsory to. But that's separate from the question whether the government has to be the one who provides it, is what I would say. So the government can provide for something to be done without administering itself. And certainly it need not necessarily be the federal government. In the case of the United States, the relationship between education and the federal government and the existence of the Department of Education and its role is hotly contested. I think, in my view, education is one of those things that ought to be decentralized. I am for a policy of devolution as much as possible. And the things that can only be done at the national level have to be done there. The things that can only be done at the international level have to be done there. I think there's far less that can only be done there than is what is often done there. Okay.
Great, thank you. Dr. Melkonian-Hoover will give you a chance, I hope, in the course of the remarks to sort of reply in the course of that. But I will open it up for questions or concerns or other ideas that you have that sort of flow out of this. I have one or two of my own, just in case we need a bit of pushing things along here. But yes, Dr. Van Pelt.
I'd like to just play with the question about education for a few minutes. Ontario is quite unique, perhaps not in Canada, but perhaps in the entire North American jurisdiction. Our Education Act provides for the public school system, and a school is only defined as something that's part of the public system. And a pupil is someone who attends the public school system. Now, as it turns out, 95% of elementary and secondary level students in Ontario do attend publicly funded, publicly provided, publicly regulated schools. So I'm just talking about the 5%, maybe 6% of students that attend private schools or for other forms of education, homeschooling being one that you offer. So we're in this unique jurisdiction where the system is prioritized over the individual. And I'm very interested in the response of both of our speakers to that, because I look over my shoulder in other provinces where the individual student is prioritized. I'm thinking of Alberta, for example. In the preamble to the Education Act, it discusses the best interest of every individual child in the province. How would you negotiate that if you were writing the policy? Would you prefer an environment where the system is prioritized, or would you prefer an environment where every individual child is given a right, has certain basic educational rights?
Dr. Melkonian, do you want to take the? Do you want to take
Well,
it
I can
first?
say something real quick.
All right, hold this while you're doing it.
I think so. The question for those viewing at home had to do with the specifics. This is for the camera.
No, yeah.
So I'm supposed to repeat the question, or one of us is supposed to repeat the question. I'm not going to repeat the whole question, but it was about the specifics of in Ontario versus, say, Alberta, where the priority of the system, the educational system, the good of the educational system is in the first place versus the individual good of the child. Well, you could probably guess that my view is that something other than the system itself is what needs to be prioritized. The student, yeah, sure, in the context of the social, the rich social architecture, the language that Cardis uses, and I would talk about the priority of the family unit, whatever that looks like, in making those determinations. I think that that's a fundamental reality. One of the other dynamics that I would like to point to has to do with the role of public education in a democratic regime. And it seems to me there are at least two sorts of ways this works out. One is where you have a really principled democratic order which is intent on building up true citizens in a free and virtuous society, the liberal arts, the sort of things that you need to learn to be a free person. And then there's a version of a democratic order which is more like what Rupke was talking about, where you've got this collective authority and a bunch of sandheap of individuals that are isolated from one another, and their only relationship is mediated by the state. In that case, adherence to the system ends up promoting a least common denominator at best, probably, in public education, whether at the K through 12 level or higher ed and so on. So I think it has to do in part with what the demos, the people, demand of that system, and what sort of cultural expectations there are which work their way out in terms of the legal order. So I just want to point to that dynamic before.
Okay. So I obviously waded right into it. And I am not an expert on education policy. I recognize my limitations here. But I do have concerns. Again, and maybe this is an extreme, but if we look at this Indian case, for instance, where you have upper and middle class folks who have not wanted to pay taxes to support the education of the broader population, for whom they have cared very little, right, in terms of their educational needs, right? And so I think you have very damaging and lasting impacts because of refusal to be taxed for those purposes. So I'm not sure I would juxtapose this as system versus individual, right? So I'm not sure that's a fair comparison. I would think that there is also a concern here for public justice and the greater good overall. I understand the Center for Public Justice's arguments in terms of this concern with, particularly with double taxation. However, I am not empathetic in the sense that private schools in the U.S. continue to, and parochial schools have not borne some of the same responsibilities that public schools do and have to do and are willing to do because that is part of their call to educate all, right? And so when they are bearing those particular expenses, and as numbers decline of students that are less expensive as they take other directions, right, there are all sorts of impacts for the common good that occur. So I am thinking of a very particular example where I know of a principal who was losing students because of, and good students who actually, where parents said, we would like to remain in your public school, but our pastor has said that we need to go to this alternative school because it is coming from our particular worldview. It is absolutely appropriate. And even though you have a very good public school here, we are going to leave and exit because we are feeling particular and perhaps in that case, undue pressure. That is not the norm. I understand that, and I support very much religious education and opportunities there. But there can be ways in which this is manipulated and does not serve the common good. And that is just something that I felt like had to be said. So.
Interestingly enough, the Center for Public Justice, which has been mentioned a couple times, having a big event tomorrow in Pittsburgh, aren't they? On public justice in the city, or public education in the city of Pittsburgh. So if you want more policy information on that, it's happening tomorrow, but it's a long drive. So we have a question from Dr. Zylstra.
Sure. It's been great so far. I really appreciate the comments from the speakers. This symposium is trying to deal with how Christians can navigate their way toward working for social justice in various areas. So as Christians navigate the political culture, they come across and run into these institutions. They run into, they have to deal with splitters, they have to deal with lumpers, they have to deal with some mixture of a lump split society. So locally, we have well-established institutions. We have lumpers, we have splitters, we can vote for them in elections. Maybe not at the extreme, but in the general sort of spectrum. However, if we have a lot of international relations students in the room, they're interested in maybe going to a developing country that has very few long-term stable institutions and working for the flourishing of the people in those developing countries. What perspective can they bring to their endeavors in those places when it comes to helping build institutions? Are lumpers, is what we need a lot of lumpers and highly centralized governmental institutions to help develop these economies, or should it be sort of maybe what the paradoxical Chinese system is a highly centralized effort at making everyone a consuming individual? So what sorts of institutions that we can take from these abstract conversations would we want Christian practitioners in the field who go into the ground, say, to help build sustainability or local commercial or economic development in a developing country that has few long-lasting stable institutions? What sort of, how can we take these abstract things that you've both been talking about, and what sort of things should we be working towards in these sort of developing contexts? I'd be interested.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Ballor, are you?
Well, I'll talk quickly.
Queued up, yeah?
Since Ruth knows a lot more about development than I do.
Yeah.
I will say there are certainly contexts in the developing world, it seems to me, where there is too little government, or certainly too little good government, and that the structures in place are not in place for flourishing, things that will be conducive to the development of sustainable enterprises and things like this. So where you have corruption, obviously that's a big one, where the rule of law is not in place. You don't have an established system of property rights, you don't have a legal order where people can redress their concerns when they are wronged and expect legal justice to be done. I will say something else about aid strategies and development strategies real quickly. I'm with the caveat that I'm not an expert in it. I was at a lecture given by Bill Easterly, whose name is well known, which I thought was very powerful because it contrasted two different views. And they correspond more or less to the lumpers and the splitters. And one, on his view, was that of Gunnar Myrdal, which has been the dominant sort of mode, which is a central planning from afar, you could say, that the developed world decides what these institutions need to look like and goes and tells them, and then brings the money and imposes them, you could say, on the developing world. I don't like that model very much. I would say that in part some of the question, some of the way that we frame the question has this sort of a, we know what is right for you, let us do it to you, sort of a posture. In many cases, I think the other view, which Easterly went on to describe as Hayek's view, is more like respecting the free responsibility and order and the local knowledge that these people have, and asking them in many cases, can we help you? How can we help you? Sometimes the answer will be no, you can't really help us, we have to help ourselves. Sometimes the answer will be yes, you can do this, that, or the other thing. So I would say we need to be careful about how we approach the question and even posing it in terms of the posture that we take, and treating them, that is other people, the way we as people would like to be treated in these kinds of discussions.
I would concur with a lot of what's been said. I think I don't like the some of the distinctions, or the sharp distinctions made between a Sachs approach, kind of one size fits all, right, and a more centralized approach, versus an Easterly, well, we'll just kind of organically figure it out in every place, and it's so distinct, and nothing apparently can translate into another society or culture, right? So, I mean, it's far more complicated than that, and we all know that if there was one silver bullet, right? If there were one easy solution, this would have been dealt with a long time ago. So I think it very much depends on if the crying need or concern is short-term or long-term, right? Where some outside groups can have the greatest efficacy, whether it's a question of government versus a question of sustainability and agrarian practices, whether it's a question of education. It feels way too complex to be able to say. Your question again was, which of the two do we prefer?
Well, how do you enter into that situation on the ground and without any sort of long-term stable institutions? We're talking about institutions and how lumped they are or how split they are. So you enter a situation that has very few long-term institutions. How do you actually engage in the practice of developmental work? Are you an advocate for some institution building? Do you need a lump to even think about splitting in the first place? Or you begin by building a legal and juridical system, as I think Jordan was pointing out, in order to put the other institutions and
in that context, right, in which they can actually flourish. And I would concur with that. And I also, again, I worry about, at times, I think, and then again, I think I probably know the U.S. case more in terms of U.S. advocacy and U.S. engagement in this, in terms of what the USAID has done, an Agency for International Development. And it tends to swing one way or the other, supporting government, building up good governance, or supporting non-governmental organizations, right? And so it tends to swing rather than kind of perhaps thinking more holistically on these things. But I do worry and setting them up against one another necessarily, and supporting NGOs and kind of the development of these international NGOs that kind of bleed some of the best within that country out of government and bankrupt governments, right? And have folks look to external organizations rather than something that they have elected right? And the alternative is also troubling, right? If everything gets dumped into governments in which there is very little transparency and evaluation. I think there are very helpful critiques coming from both sides, and I wish these two men in particular would stop being so vitriolic and rude, and find ways in which we could, if we're all wanting the greater end in the end, couldn't there not be more areas of compatibility and cooperation, perhaps?
Can I push you just one little bit further than that?
Yeah.
I sort of, want to get in. I mean, I'm wondering what specific, we've mentioned, especially in the developing world, and for students in the room who may have, I think, this question. So there are non-governmental organizations and government organizations that look at building things like public justice systems or democratic reform and these kinds of things. There are ones that look at economic reform and kind of growing economies. In your opinion, as someone who studies the developing world and someone who's worked on these issues, where are the kind of gaps that you think students today could be particularly keen to look at in terms of, these are the parts of societies, either our own or even abroad, that are especially in need of kind of, architectonic reform?
Well, so I'm going to give a plug for my husband's organization. He works for the Institute for Global Engagement.
That's why I said
Yeah, thank you. You set me up so nicely. I figured that's what you were doing. And I appreciate that. I do appreciate organizations like IGE or International Justice Mission that are not just, that are thinking about how can we work with, in partnership with organizations, with governments to improve policies and change structures, right, so that there can be far greater flourishing. So how can we be in conversation with and discuss and provide a whole range of models that governments can test out and explore, rather than just a one-size-fits-all, but engaging in ways and having perhaps a foray in ways that a government-to-government relation may not. So the Institute for Global Engagement works particularly on questions of religious freedom and pluralism and helping governments think in that regard. And of course, IJM is not only doing kind of efforts to bring folks out of sex trafficking in terms of direct exit, but also trying to help governments think about how they can improve their system and security forces and so on to address these issues. And so I definitely I'm encouraging our students to be doing those things, right? Go to law school, right? Understand policy. Think about these things very carefully. The needs are great. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah. In terms of the future and moving forward, I appreciate some of the stuff around public education system that's being said. I live in one of our country's poorest communities just downtown here. My kids go to the public school there. The Fraser Institute ranked in the bottom 30 of the 3,000 schools when they ranked it 4 years ago. Something we choose to do. But one of the things I realized when I travel more specifically in Canada, and don't know the American system that well, is the answer to that is not around public policy around education for me, because people gather in clusters, and they gather in clusters for a number of reasons, but often you have people that have higher barriers to healthy living gathered in certain clusters around. So one of our Hamilton stats is if you live in my neighborhood, your average age expectancy is 21 years younger than the richest suburban neighborhood in Hamilton. That's staggering, isn't it? Over 2 years, very excited with that. So one of the things I'd like to comment on is I think that one of the solutions to this is by having people of more affluence and often higher skill set move into neighborhoods where that is uncommon. And the blended neighborhood, I believe, as people rub shoulders, creates a monstrous solution or a marvelous solution to some of the things that we're struggling with. However, the only people I know that are willing to do that are typically Christians who are willing to follow the model of Christ and say, I will die to self so others can live. So I don't know what you think about that. I think about that in terms of possible solution. I personally think, out of a conversation like this, that is one of the most marvelous and far-reaching solutions when people who have healthier lifestyles, for various reasons, are able to move in beside people who are struggling to have that and share life together. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'll say something. I have two thoughts about that in response. The first is that I'll frame it in terms of the challenges of affluence, I would say. So Robert Nesbitt was a sociologist who wrote a lot about the dynamics of community and order. And reading some of his stuff, it reminds me of Lewis's vision of the Great Divorce in this sense, that when we have affluence, we have material prosperity, we have the ability to manifest things that we want, to make them explicit. So in many cases, what we want to do, it seems, by the choices we make, those of us who have that affluence, is to move away from people and go further out and live in a community, various kinds, but sometimes gated, sometimes not. Certainly not pressed in, right, in an urban setting or something like this. And that has really corrosive consequences in many cases. And so the choices we make that are made possible by material prosperity says a lot about what we want, right? The market and our success, the prosperity that it engenders, allows us to manifest things which are not good. It allows us to make bad choices. The other thing, just to echo one of the things that you were talking about in terms of Christian engagement in these areas, there's a school in Grand Rapids called the Potter's House. And one of the things we've been doing at the Acton Institute is doing some video curriculum of various kinds. And one of them, the more recent ones, is called Our Great Exchange. And one of the features, it's probably a 12-minute long video, focuses on a community of people who felt this call to go in to a really rough area in Grand Rapids and create a private school. It's a private school. And what they learned and all these sorts of things. So I just want to echo that, the reality that there are people who are called to do those sorts of things, and that it's really praiseworthy kind of work and really essential. And they've done amazing things, and we need more missions like that, I would say.
Yeah.
Did you want to respond to that?
No, amen.
No? All right.
Yeah.
Then we will refer to
Yeah.
the president.
Thank you both for stimulating the conversation. I have a comment and then a question that's entirely separate from the comment. Okay, so with respect to private schooling, I'm president here of a private school, so it will be no surprise what my opinion is. But I actually thought, Jordan, that you were going to say something different in your response on that there is some other third way. Now, you did say something about the priority of the family, but I also wonder if there's something else or much more that can be said. For example, one could say, well, what is the function of education in the first place? And is not the education of the child the public good? Right? Secondly, with respect to that, could you not both advocate for, if you will, choice and for a pluralistic public system? Those are not incompatible, it seems to me. So just a couple of comments with respect to private education. I'd welcome your response on that.
I can say something real quick.
Yeah, please.
I agree. I think there's lots that could be done. I don't think competition is necessarily a bad thing in terms of education, both at the higher education level and the secondary education level. So I don't know what the mechanism looks like in the United States. Again, the systems are very different. The other thing that I'll say, and I thought you were going to say this that I didn't say, was it's too often the case, and we do this, I think, with the material provision of assistance to the poor, to equate something that the government provides with something that another institution provides. At least in the United States, it seems, the system is set up that you cannot ground an education, you cannot center it on the person of Jesus Christ. So I think there is at least a qualitative difference in theory, if not in practice, in all of these different schools that needs to be taken into account. And I think the same thing is true for the public welfare system versus private charities and things. The sorts of work that private charities do in giving a cup of cold water explicitly in Jesus' names in many cases can be, and I think ought to be, viewed as qualitatively different than the mere provision of material resources or mere knowledge about social science and reading and arithmetic and these sorts of things. So I would like to add that to what I said previously.
Did you have another question to before?
Different question altogether. To take it back to globalization, this has nothing to do with private education. Let me give you two examples. The quagmire in Syria has presented this enormous challenge, and short of a clear answer to that challenge, most people today tend to say, most governments today tend to say, the only solution for Syria is the solution that Syrians have to develop. Or, let me give you another example. I know someone who has worked for many years in Haiti. Of course, we all know the challenges that Haiti has faced, especially since the earthquake. I don't remember how many years ago now. This person worked a decade or longer there, deeply dedicated, came away deeply disillusioned, now no longer believes in working in Haiti, and says, you know what, we put all that effort and money in, and at the end of the day, all I can say is the only people that can fix Haiti are Haitians. How do you respond to that?
I think I might come to you first. Or...
Haiti, really?
I was going to come to you first on this, unless you want to defer to him. It's the easy one, right? All right, who's going to take it from me?
Oh, wow.
Well, I have to say
All right.
something. I'm not going to solve the world's problems, certainly, or the specific problems in these nations. I think that kind of disillusionment is understandable. It also depends in part on what our expectations are for the end game. That is, we're called to be faithful, not necessarily successful. And if we are faithful, that is a success in itself, in a way. And if we can know that we have been faithful, then we should rest easy. There are things that we can control and that we can't control. And to leave it up to God, in a sense, those things that we really can't control. I would be remiss if I didn't mention in this context another of our series that we have. It's called Poverty Cure. If I went back to the Acton Institute and didn't mention our video curriculum, I might be in big trouble. So one of the features is on Haiti, actually, and so that's a curriculum I can recommend to you if you're looking for a perspective that emphasizes the development of local sustainable enterprise solutions to poverty and addressing those. Certainly Haiti is a prime example of a country that's had a lot of resources, both spiritual and material, poured into it. The other thing I would say is, and it relates to what we view success as, is, okay, so maybe the GDP of Haiti is the same as it was, we've made no difference there. Aren't there people that have been helped? I mean, couldn't you point to concrete examples of individuals? Even if you can't point to the systemic changes that you're hoping for, I would hope that there are lives that have been changed and success stories, even if they're at the individual level and even if they're few and far between. That's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I would echo that as well in terms of this question. Of course, I mean, we continue, we carry on, we persevere, right? We know that justice will prevail. We don't know when, right? But we know that it will prevail and that we are called to pursue it. And Haiti is such a deeply entrenched, multi-layered. The issues are so multiple that it feels like, of course, there are groups that are coming at it from very different angles and are going to very slowly, I would hope, be able to make and change and reform. I am given some hope by having some Haitian students that have come and have prepared themselves and equipped themselves and plan to go back at some point and return and try to enter the government. But that is also going to be a very slow process, right, to enter something that is so fallen and needs such need of incredible reform. But I do believe in gradual, slow, sustainable change rather than radical overhaul. And so those are the kinds of individuals in whom I do hold out and have some hope in, and I would concur with Jordan. There have been lives changed, things have been done, and we also don't know if things wouldn't be worse than they are today if nothing had been done whatsoever.
All right, we are very nearly out of time here. We have time for, I think, one last question. I saw a hand at the back of the room, I think, from President of Cardis, Michael Van Pelt. So please, your question, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Zylstra. Dr. Ballor, you must be a gentle and graceful man. The reason I observe that is because I think that Dr. Melkonian-Hoover was actually saying, sir, I'm looking for an argument. When that came, I usually can observe a little red at the neck and around the ears and stuff like that, and you are a cool cucumber. So maybe the argument was looking like this. John, or Jordan, you got it wrong. Let me give you an illustration from a public education point of view and a Christian education point of view. It sounded a lot like contrast to me, the way it was described. We will steal the one from the other and the other will hurt, is what I think I heard. I'm not completely sure, although I'm pretty sure. Two illustrations to maybe comment on. In Canada, by far the majority of Christians attend public school. A very small majority of Christians attend private schools. I think that might be the same for the U.S. You will know better than I do. Publicly, generally the ones in public school are really good Christians, and the one in private school, they're the crazy Christians, a little bit socially divisive ones. Let's keep them in that 6%. Second illustration, there's a little town in your country named Pottsville. It's in Pennsylvania. It just succeeded in getting its first charter school. There's 200 people in that charter school. It has the highest demand for special needs in that school, 35% compared to the public school system. When I visited that town, the thought came to mind that that little kind of school set aside there that's different than everything else may be the best thing that ever happened, not for the 200 kids, not for the 60 or 70 of them with special needs, but for the whole system altogether. So I may say thank you to that Christian parent who says, I think I'm going to send my child to that charter school because it kind of fits with my educational perspective. I'm going to say thank you, number one, you did what's best for your child, and I'm going to say thank you, you know what, you're going to make this whole town of Pottsville way better than it was yesterday.
Let's hope.
So, were there differences there, Dr. Ballor, or not? I know a bit of your history, and I just didn't see the continuity there. I think you should take up the challenge.
Okay.
That's my kind of question.
I think what we've proved is that I'm not a very good listener, apparently. I will say this, and it echoes some of the things that I said in answer to an earlier question and develops it a bit. I think, and maybe again, I'm not a very good listener, if I understood you right, one of the implications might be that there is a real opportunity for a mission field, basically, in education, to some of these, whatever sense you mean it, marginalized populations. And it is damning, I think, if Christians are willing to spend lots and lots of money to basically extract their children from problematic situations and not get their hands dirty with people who we don't want to associate with, to make their lives easier. So there are better and worse motivations, certainly, for going to a private school. And not all private schools are religiously focused. But why not Christians opening these kinds of schools that are targeted towards the people who are really in need? I mean, this is one of the great legacies of the Christian church, is providing services in many contexts before the government, wouldn't care to. Maybe that's an opportunity also in places like India. One of the things, the point of departure for this conference is Ron Sider's clarion call for what the responsibilities of rich Christians are. And one of the things that I like to talk about is why don't we do more ourselves as a church? And don't fall back on the excuse of, we're already being taxed a lot. Yeah, okay, so it's going to hurt more or whatever. don't wait until you get your taxes lowered to do more and to invest more and to tithe and all these sorts of things. And there's lots of things that can be done with the material resources that we have at our disposal, despite whatever the tax burden is on us in the developed world. And that's one of the things that Ron Sider has emphasized consistently, even over the changes between the editions of Rich Christensen and An Age of Hunger, for example, is that very clear responsibility for, in Kuyper's words, that the holy art of giving for Jesus' sake ought to be much more strongly developed among us Christians. And I think there's a clear continuity there between Kuyper and Sider that has implications for the kinds of things that we do in terms of international development and education and so on.
Oh, no, I just wanted to ask you, could you, since you took on that challenge, what of the challenge that transnational issues may require good transnational government? Transnational terrorist networks, transnational and multinational corporations, who can appropriately invest, govern, address, regulate, support, and so on?
So it may not be a surprise if I'm not a big fan of a global government. And this is one thing that Ruth brought up earlier. It's the long quote from Caritas and Veritate. In the meantime, which at the time it caused a great stir among various quarters of Roman Catholics. And I believe it was the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace ended up releasing a separate letter later about the possibility towards reforming a world international order, a political order. I will say that, like I said before, the things that can only be done at the international level effectively ought to be done there. It's not obvious to me what those things are. It's not obvious to me, again, I'm not an expert in these areas, so you can tell me better how effective the United Nations has been and whether the United States has a direct responsibility towards Syria or whether it's something else, some other international organization. That's beyond my pay grade. I don't know. So I don't know what those things are. My closest analog that I can think of in another sphere would be something like the ecumenical movement in the Christian church. And I've spent a lot more time thinking about that than global politics as such. And I absolutely do affirm the principle of subsidiarity. And I do think that there are things that a global ecumenical movement should be taking up in terms of the Christian church. I happen to think that it's not usually the things that they have taken up. But I do think there is a role for that. So, yeah. Sorry.
Thanks.
Well, sadly, we are at our end here this evening, but not to worry. It continues tomorrow. And you can join us for chapel at 11 a.m., where Dr. Ruth Melkonian-Hoover will continue the reflections which have been begun here tonight, but especially, what exactly is the title of your talk, Ruth? I want to get it exactly right. There's it. Well, I'm sorry. It's it's right on the back of my. Oh, wonderful. Faithful leadership, women, religion, and development. Thank you.
It's more on women, men, and the body of Christ.
Very good. Okay, and that will be our opportunity. And then, of course, there is an opportunity to also continue to dine with our speakers and our panelists. And then panels all afternoon. It's a virtual buffet. And then we can come back to hear, I think, the sharp answers that we're still waiting for from Dr. Ballor on what exactly this arrangement of institutions looks like, which we call social justice. But please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers this evening. Good night and God bless.
Yes.
I was going to go out.